I always knew there was something eerie about dense forests, the kind of silence that wasn't entirely silent. It wasn't the hum of the wind or the chirp of distant birds. It was something deeper, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to disturb its secrets. My name is Ryan, and I wasn't particularly drawn to the supernatural. In fact, I avoided it. But when my best friend Sam called me late one evening, his voice shaky with excitement and fear, I couldn't refuse him. He had found something in the archives of our university. A map. Not just any map, but one that hinted at the location of an ancient hidden temple buried deep within the Velora forest, a place infamous for swallowing explorers whole. Sam was convinced it was more than just a temple. The map, scrawled in faded ink, spoke of the altar of the Forgotten One, a deity worshipped by a lost civilization, one that seemed to have disappeared overnight, leaving no trace. Sam wanted to find it, not for fame or wealth, but for answers. He believed there was something extraordinary about the temple, something that history books had deliberately erased. Against my better judgment, I agreed to join him. The lure of uncovering something unknown was intoxicating, even if I wouldn't admit it. By the next morning, we were on our way, a small group of 4. Sam, myself, Clara, a historian with a penchant for the occult, and Ethan, a documentary filmmaker who never went anywhere without his camera. The Velhora forest was more foreboding than I had imagined. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was damp and heavy, and every step we took felt like an intrusion. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest seemed alive, not with creatures, but with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Sam led the way, clutching the map like it was the Holy Grail. Clara whispered bits of lore as we walked, stories of villagers who claimed to hear whispers in the forest, voices that lured them into the depths, never to return. Ethan, ever the skeptic, laughed it off, but I noticed he kept his camera rolling, as if he didn't entirely disbelieve. It was on the 3rd day that we found it, the first sign that we were on the right track. A stone pillar, barely visible beneath a thick coat of moss, jutted out from the earth. Strange carvings adorned its surface, symbols that Clara identified as being from a long-lost dialect. She traced her fingers over them, her expression a mix of awe and unease. This isn't in any record I've ever seen," she murmured. As we pressed on, more signs appeared. Fragments of statues, overgrown pathways, and what seemed like the remains of an ancient staircase, crumbling yet unmistakably deliberate. The excitement in the group was palpable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping behind a tree, or a flicker of light that disappeared the moment I turned my head. By the time we reached the temple itself, the sun was beginning to set, casting the forest in an eerie orange glow. The structure loomed before us, half buried in the earth, as if the forest had been trying to swallow it whole. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The stone walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of worship, sacrifice, and what looked like something emerging from the ground, something massive and grotesque. Ethan set up his camera, capturing every detail while Clara muttered a prayer under her breath. Sam, on the other hand, was mesmerized. "This is it," he whispered, his voice trembling. The altar of the forgotten one. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was dread. The air around the temple was different, heavier, colder. The silence was no longer just silence. It was oppressive, almost suffocating. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft that I almost thought I had imagined it. But I hadn't. Sam froze, his eyes wide. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the ground beneath us trembled ever so slightly, as if the temple itself had stirred from a long slumber. And that's when I knew, whatever we had stumbled upon, it was not meant to be found. The trembling beneath our feet was brief, but it left us all frozen in place, our breaths caught in our throats. The air felt different, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I couldn't tell if the others felt it too, but the unease that had been building inside me had now turned into something I couldn't ignore. Sam, however, seemed oblivious. His excitement only grew as he hurried toward the temple entrance, brushing aside the vines and moss that had consumed its surface. "This is incredible," he muttered, his fingers tracing the carvings on the massive stone door. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, or perhaps it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Sam, wait. These carvings. They're warnings." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, adjusting his camera to focus on the doorway. Clara pointed to a series of figures etched into the stone. "Look here. This isn't just a depiction of worship. It's a ritual. They're offering something, or someone, to whatever that is." Her finger hovered over an image of a grotesque, otherworldly figure that seemed to rise from the earth. Its form was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its presence was unmistakably malevolent. "Sacrifice," she whispered. Sam shook his head, brushing her concerns aside. "It's just mythology. Ancient civilizations always used fear to control their people. This is no different." But Clara wasn't convinced, and neither was I. Something about the carvings felt too deliberate, too urgent, as if the warnings were meant for us. Despite Clara's protests, Sam pushed open the heavy stone door. It groaned in protest, the sound reverberating through the forest like a dying gasp. Beyond the doorway was darkness, thick and impenetrable. Sam turned on his flashlight and stepped inside without hesitation. "Sam, wait," I called, but he was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. Ethan followed, his camera light cutting through the gloom. Clara hesitated, her fear evident, but she eventually stepped in after them. I was the last to enter, my heart pounding in my chest as I crossed the threshold. The air inside was cold, far colder than it had any right to be. The walls were lined with more carvings, but these were different. They weren't warnings. They were scenes of terror. People running, screaming, their faces contorted in agony as shadowy figures loomed over them. "Guys, this place doesn't feel right," I said, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. Sam ignored me, his flashlight sweeping across the chamber. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The central chamber." At the center of the room stood an altar, carved from a single massive stone. It was covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were alive. Surrounding the altar were piles of what looked like offerings. Ancient coins, broken pottery, and fragments of jewelry. But there was something else too. Something that sent a chill down my spine. Bones. Human bones. Clara gasped, covering her mouth. This isn't right. We shouldn't be here. Ethan, ever the documentarian, moved closer to the altar, his camera capturing every detail. This is incredible, he murmured, his focus unwavering. But then something happened. As Ethan stepped closer, the faint pulsing of the symbols grew stronger, their glow illuminating the room in an eerie light. The air grew heavier, and the whispers returned louder this time. They weren't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Sam nodded, his eyes wide. It's like they're calling to us. Calling to us? Clara snapped. This isn't some archaeological find, Sam. This is a tomb, a warning. We need to leave. But before we could move, the ground trembled again, more violently this time. The altar began to crack, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter until they were almost blinding. And then we saw it. A shadow, darker than the deepest night, began to rise from the altar. It had no definite form, shifting and writhing like smoke, but its presence was suffocating. It was as if the air itself was being pulled toward it, drained of life. Ethan stumbled backward, his camera shaking in his hands. What? What is that? I don't know, Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. But it's beautiful. Beautiful. The word made no sense. There was nothing beautiful about the thing before us. It was terror made manifest, a void that seemed to consume everything in its path. And then it moved. Not physically, it didn't have a body to move, but its presence shifted, surging toward us like a wave. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and I felt something cold and claw-like brush against my mind, prying into my thoughts, my fears. Run! Clara screamed, snapping us out of our trance. We turned and bolted for the entrance, but the temple wasn't done with us. The walls seemed to close in, the carvings twisting and shifting as if they were alive. The ground beneath us cracked and splintered, and I could hear something. No, someone, laughing. A cruel, mocking sound that echoed in my ears. By the time we reached the door, the temple was shaking violently, as if it were trying to trap us inside. Ethan tripped, his camera slipping from his hands and shattering on the stone floor. Leave it! I shouted, pulling him to his feet. We burst out into the forest, gasping for air, but the whispers followed us, faint but unmistakable. And as I looked back, I saw the shadow. It was still there, lingering at the entrance of the temple, watching us, waiting. We hadn't escaped. Not really. Whatever we had awakened, it wasn't done with us yet. We didn't stop running until the temple was far behind us, its shadow swallowed by the dense foliage of the forest. But no distance felt far enough. The air around us was heavy with something I couldn't name. Like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Ethan stumbled to his knees, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. What was that? He managed to say, his voice trembling. None of us answered. What could we say? Even Sam, who always had some explanation or theory, was silent, his face pale and drenched with sweat. Clara kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting toward the path we'd taken, as if expecting the shadow to follow us out of the temple. I sank to the ground, my legs too weak to hold me. My mind raced with the events of the past hour, but no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't. What we'd seen, it wasn't just unnatural. It was wrong, something that didn't belong in our world. "We have to go back," Sam finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go back?" Clara snapped, whirling on him. "Are you insane? Did you not see what happened in there? We barely got out alive." "But we woke it up," Sam argued, his voice growing desperate. "Don't you get it? It wasn't supposed to happen. The altar, the symbols. Maybe there's a way to reverse it, to put it back before—" "Before what?" Ethan interrupted. "Before it kills us, because that's exactly what's going to happen if we go back in there." Sam opened his mouth to respond, but a sound cut him off. A low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't coming from the temple. It was coming from the forest. We froze. The silence around us suddenly deafening. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of leaves rustling and twigs snapping. "There's something out there," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Move," I said, pulling myself to my feet. "We need to move now." But as we turned to leave, the forest seemed to shift around us. The path we'd taken was gone, replaced by dense thickets of trees and vines that hadn't been there before. It was as if the forest itself was alive, closing in on us, trapping us. "We're lost," Ethan said, panic creeping into his voice. "We're completely lost." "No, we're not," Sam said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We just need to stay calm and—" Another growl, this time so close it felt like it was right behind us. I turned, my flashlight sweeping the darkness. But there was nothing there, nothing but shadows. And then they moved. At first I thought it was just the flicker of the flashlight, a trick of the light, but the shadows were moving, shifting across the ground and trees, taking form. They were humanoid, but barely. Tall, spindly figures with elongated limbs and faces that were little more than hollow voids. One of them stepped closer, its form flickering like a dying flame. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was bound by the same rules of existence as us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her with me. We ran, our footsteps pounding against the forest floor. But no matter how fast we went, the shadows were faster. They didn't follow us. They surrounded us, appearing ahead of us no matter which direction we turned. "This can't be real," Ethan screamed, his voice breaking. But it was real, too real. The whispers were back, louder now, swirling around us in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. They weren't speaking any language I knew, but their intent was clear. Rage, hunger, and something far worse. Malice. One of the shadows reached out, its elongated arms stretching impossibly far. I felt a cold, piercing pain as its hand brushed against my shoulder, and I stumbled, the world spinning around me. "Get up," Clara screamed, pulling me to my feet. We burst into a small clearing, the shadows stopping just at the edge, as if they couldn't, or wouldn't, cross. In the center of the clearing was an ancient tree. Its gnarled branches twisted into shapes that resembled faces, faces that were screaming. Clara gasped, pointing to the base of the tree. There, half buried in the dirt, was another altar. Smaller than the one in the temple, but unmistakably similar. Its symbols glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "It's a binding site," Clara said, her voice filled with both fear and realization. "The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was a prison. This is how they kept it contained." "Then what do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Clara hesitated, her eyes darting between the altar and the shadows that lingered at the edge of the clearing. I don't know. There's no manual for this. But the shadows didn't wait. One of them stepped into the clearing, its form flickering violently, as if the space was resisting it. It let out a sound, a guttural, ear-splitting scream that made the ground tremble. "Do something!" Ethan shouted. Sam stepped forward, his eyes locked on the altar. Maybe we can use it to seal it again," he said, his voice shaking. "How?" I asked. "I don't know," he snapped, "but we don't have a choice." Before we could stop him, Sam placed his hands on the altar. The symbols flared to life, their light so bright it was blinding. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering wildly, but they didn't retreat. And then Sam screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was something deeper, more primal, as if his very soul was being torn apart. The light from the altar spread, consuming him, and for a moment, the shadows froze, their movements halting, and then they vanished. The clearing fell silent, the whispers gone, the forest still, but Sam was gone too. The altar, once glowing with life, was now dark, its surface cracked and lifeless. We stood there, too stunned to speak, the weight of what had happened settling over us. Sam had sacrificed himself to save us, but at what cost? As we made our way back through the forest, the path somehow clear now, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped, that whatever we had awoken was still out there, waiting. And I knew one thing for certain. I would never set foot in a forest again.